Stay with us until the end of this video to uncover how you, too, can master the battlefields of the far future. But first, let us take you back to a time when the records of history began to echo a haunting refrain. The sacred shrines were looted, the fertile lands left scarred and burning. Churchyards ran red with the blood of holy men. Champions of the clans were cut down, their courage extinguished. Families were torn apart, wives and children enslaved. It was then that Ireland awoke to the brutal truth of what had arrived on her shores, the unyielding wrath of the Vikings. In the year 795, only 2 years after their first strike on England, the Norsemen set their sights on Ireland. Like a relentless tide, their fleets returned year after year, growing bolder with each assault. In time, these raiders ceased to merely plunder. They began to settle. Along Ireland's coasts and waterways, the Vikings established fortified colonies. Dublin, once a quiet stretch of land, transformed into a bustling stronghold of Viking influence. It became a hub of trade, where goods, treasures, and even human lives were exchanged, linking Ireland to a vast and ruthless network of commerce. Stretching across the known world, these colonies flourished with the arrival of Scandinavian nobles, among them the infamous Ivar the Boneless, who carved out their own dynasties of power. Yet, the Vikings found the land beyond the coastal settlements a different kind of battleground. The heart of Ireland was a fractured but fiercely defended tapestry of over 100 petty kingdoms, each led by proud and defiant clans. Life in these lands was a blend of simplicity and pride. The Irish people fortified themselves in ring forts, stone or earthen enclosures overlooking lush farmland and grazing pastures. Their clothing spoke of practicality and status. Linen tunics, woolen cloaks, and intricately crafted brooches that gleamed with the artistry of their culture. The Vikings may have brought war, but they also left an indelible mark on Ireland, shaping its history, its cities, and its destiny in ways that would echo through the centuries. Although Ireland had embraced Christianity through the tireless efforts of St. Patrick in the 5th century, the land the Vikings encountered was far from saintly or serene. The Ireland of their time was a land of unceasing strife, where clans plundered, raided, and waged war in an unending quest for dominance. Into this volatile landscape stepped the Viking warrior society, finding itself not as conquerors of a defenseless people, but as rivals to an equally warlike Irish culture. The clash of these two warrior traditions painted a brutal and complex picture of conflict. The Vikings, clad in helmets and protected by a patchwork of armor, wielded spears, swords, and the fearsome great axes that became synonymous with their name. By contrast, the Irish fought with little to no armor, relying on their agility and dexterity. They bore small, maneuverable shields, spears, swords, and darts, embracing a swift and fluid style of combat. The Vikings unleashed havoc upon the land, slaying kings, plundering monasteries, and exacting tribute from the conquered. Yet the Irish were not passive victims. They struck back with such ferocity that the Norse invaders found themselves compelled to adapt or perish. To survive, Viking leaders began forging alliances, not with brute force alone, but through the shrewd tools of politics and diplomacy. Some Vikings married into Irish noble families, entwining their fates with the very clans they had once sought to subjugate. Others converted to Christianity, adopting the faith of the land while wielding its customs as a means of integration and control. But these alliances came with peril. Favoring one clan inevitably turned others into enemies, and coalitions of Irish lords rose time and again to challenge the Norsemen's growing influence. It was a battle not just for territory, but for survival, identity, and power. The Vikings may have brought their own warrior ethos, but they found in Ireland a culture every bit as fierce and unyielding as their own, where victory was hard-won, and alliances were as treacherous as the stormy seas they had crossed to get there. Ousted from Dublin in 902, the Vikings unleashed a wave of devastation with a ferocity that surpassed even their earlier raids. Returning with unmatched aggression, They recaptured Dublin and waged relentless war on the neighboring kingdoms. Chroniclers of the time wrote grimly of this pagan horde, a people who bore no reverence for God or man, who recognized no law or protection beyond their own bloodlust. They brought Ireland to its knees, reducing its people to bondage and servitude. Many vibrant and lively women, many gentle and hopeful youths, were torn from their homes, spirited away across the broad, unyielding sea to lives of oppression and despair. Countless bright, brilliant eyes, once filled with light, were clouded by tears, their gazes dimmed by the sorrow of separation. Sons were ripped from fathers, daughters from mothers, brothers from brothers, entire families shattered, their bonds severed as they were cast adrift from their clans and tribes. Nowhere did the Viking scourge leave a deeper mark than in the southern kingdom of Munster. It was from this blood-soaked land that a man would rise, a man who would change the course of Irish history forever. His name was Brian Boru. The chronicles of his life would later proclaim, "Bad was the luck of the foreigners on the day when that youth was born." Yet Brian's beginnings were far from auspicious. Born into the Dal Kai's clan, his father held the chief's throne, but Brian was likely the youngest of 12 sons, destined for neither power nor glory. These were dark times, and the shadow of war claimed much of Brian's family, including his father and many of his brothers, leaving the clan battered and vulnerable. In the aftermath, Brian's elder brother, Mathcamain, rose to leadership and sought peace with the Vikings, striking a fragile truce. But Brian, still a young warrior, would not abide it. The histories speak of his unrelenting defiance. By day and by night, he hunted the Vikings, embracing the wilderness and the hardships of war. Sleeping on the damp ground, he and his men became one with the wild, exchanging kill for kill in a brutal war of attrition. Yet the toll was heavy. Brian's followers dwindled until only 15 warriors remained by his side. Weary but unbroken, Brian returned to reproach his brother. He stood before Mathcamain and the Council of Chiefs, his words burning with passion and grief. He condemned the truce, invoking the memory of their forebears, who had fought and died for the honor of their clan. His fiery conviction swayed the council, and Mathcamain, though a man of diplomacy, heeded his younger brother's call. This was but the beginning of Brian Boru's journey, a man forged in the crucible of loss, driven by a relentless will to resist, and destined to unite a fractured Ireland against the Viking tide. In 967, Brian and his warriors met their Viking enemies in a decisive and merciless battle. The Norsemen were routed, their forces shattered, and their leaders beheaded as they fled toward their stronghold in Limerick. But Brian, though celebrated for his bravery and wisdom, was not known for mercy. When his forces reached the Viking town, they unleashed devastation. The fort and the bustling settlement were engulfed in smoke and fire, leaving only ruin in their wake. The surviving captives were brought to the hills. Those deemed fit for war were executed without hesitation, and those deemed fit for slavery were condemned to chains. It was a brutal but clear assertion of power, a victory that solidified Brian's strength and marked the beginning of his ascendancy. Following this triumph, Brian's brother Mathcamain ruled as King of Munster. However, the peace was short-lived. In 976, old rivalries flared, leading to Mathcamain's capture and execution by his enemies. This tragedy set the stage for Brian's rise, even as whispers of Ireland's ancient past lingered in the air. The pagan kings of old, buried in earth and legend, left behind bloodlines claimed by countless pretenders. Their sacred mounds, groves, and stones remained objects of reverence, holding sway over the hearts of many. It was beneath the sacred tree of his clan, the Dalcatian symbol of continuity and strength, that Brian ascended to the kingship of his people. Without delay, he began consolidating power, rallying his forces to avenge his brother's death and restore his clan's dominance. In a dramatic raid on a monastic island, Brian slew the Viking ruler of Limerick and his sons, leaving no question about his intent. His vengeance did not end there. He hunted down Mathgamain's killers and reclaimed authority over Munster, carving his name into the annals of Irish history. But Brian's meteoric rise did not go unnoticed. His growing power drew the ire of Mael Secnail II, the High King of Ireland and a formidable ruler in his own right. Mael Secnail had proven his might in 980, forcing the powerful Vikings of Dublin to submit to his rule. Now he turned his attention southward, raiding Brian's lands and even uprooting the sacred Delcashin tree, a calculated insult designed to break Brian's spirit. Furious but undeterred, Brian waged a relentless war against his rival for years, continuing to subdue surrounding territories and strengthen his hold on Munster. Demonstrating his resourcefulness, Brian even enlisted the fleets of subjugated Vikings, using their ships to carry his armies deep into Mael Secnail's lands. By 997, after more than a decade of hostilities, the two kings reached an uneasy peace. Though the details of their accord remained shadowed by time, it marked a pivotal moment in Brian's quest for supremacy. His relentless drive, marked by both cunning diplomacy and ruthless warfare, was gradually reshaping Ireland, setting the stage for his eventual rise to the pinnacle of power as one of the island's greatest kings. It was agreed that Mael Secnail would retain rule of the north and Brian Boru would be king over the south. It was perhaps this shift in overlordship that stirred Sitric Silkbeard, the Viking king of Dublin, into rebellion along with the province of Leinster. The might of Dublin had long laid dormant under Mael Secnail. Now was a chance to test this Brian Boru of Munster. The king answered. In the closing days of 999, Brian Boru and his new ally, Mael Secnail, marched toward Dublin. The Dublin Norse and the men of Leinster sallied out to confront them at the Great Pitched Battle of Glenmama. The armies fought with dauntless courage, and the hills were painted with carnage. Hundreds fell to the victorious spears and swords of Brian's men. Brian then did to the Vikings as they had done to his people. At the dawn of the year 1000, Brian's army descended upon Dublin, laying waste to the city with fire and sword. Its bustling markets, overflowing with stolen treasures and goods from across the seas, were plundered without mercy. The scale of the victory was immense. So many Viking women and children were captured that later chronicles, likely embellished, claimed that Irish farmers no longer toiled in their fields, as their work was now carried out by these enslaved foreigners. Yet Brian's relationship with the Vikings was as shrewd as it was ruthless. His power rested not merely on conquest, but on a pragmatic ability to turn enemies into allies. When Sitric Silkbeard, the Viking king of Dublin, submitted to him, Brian allowed him to reclaim his throne, demonstrating a calculated leniency. Over time, many of these so-called foreign invaders began to merge into a distinct Norse-Irish identity, blurring the lines between conqueror and conquered. Sitric himself had a complex connection to Brian. He was the son of Brian's wife, or former wife, from her prior marriage to Olaf Queren, the late Viking king of Dublin. Brian skillfully capitalized on this familial tie, further solidifying Sitric's loyalty by arranging a marriage between one of his daughters from another union and Sitric. In doing so, Brian transformed a rebellious adversary into a son-in-law, binding the Viking ruler to his growing Irish empire through blood and allegiance. With Dublin subdued, Brian brought all of Ireland's great Viking ports under his control. These hubs of trade and seafaring, once symbols of Norse domination, now became assets of Brian's reign. The wealth that flowed from their commerce enriched his coffers. The fine ships bolstered his navy, and the warriors they supplied strengthened his armies. By the turn of the millennium, Brian had not only broken the Viking grip on Ireland, but had harnessed their strength to consolidate his rule, setting the stage for his ascent to the ultimate title, High King of Ireland. Certain of his own strength, Brian contested the rule of Mael Secnail in the north. The latter attempted to mount resistance, but ultimately conceded. So it was that Brian Boru became the High King of Ireland. The aging king made great journeys across his realm, securing the formal submission of recalcitrant kings and courting the favor of Armagh, the influential church said to have been founded by St. Patrick. Their cleric bestowed on Brian Title Imperator Scotorum, Emperor of the Gales. His high kingship begot relative peace. He busied himself building great forts and round towers and patronizing churches. But the ambitions of subject dynasties meant that there was nearly always a defiant lord in revolt. Catastrophe struck in 1013 when Dublin and Leinster again rebelled. Mael Shinel aided Brian and marched to pacify Dublin, but some of his forces, including his son, were slaughtered by Sitric. Sitric then recruited Vikings from overseas to challenge Brian. Earls and warriors from the Orkneys and Isle of Man sailed into Dublin Bay. Some of these men had likely aided in the Danish conquest and brief rule of England months earlier. And in 1014, the graying King Brian, variously recorded between the ages of 73 and 88, mustered an army several thousand strong, with aid from a distant edge of the Gaelic world, an Earl of northeast Scotland. Over the spring they ravaged rebellious lands on the path to Dublin. Later histories framed the coming battle as a last stand for the fate of Ireland. Such overstatement notwithstanding, the threat of a revived autonomous Viking Dublin with foreign backing was indeed grave. The morning of Good Friday, Brian beheld this enemy across a plain. They spread far, their Norse shields, mail, and helmets shining in the rising sun. Later accounts of the battle have it that the army of Brian, led by his son Merchad, met the charge of the Leinster forces and the Viking flanks closed in. It was poetically told that in these roaring hours spent hacking and stabbing, men were so doused in blood as to be unrecognizable to their kin, and their spears became heavy with the hair of butchered enemies. Brian's son, Merchad, perished, but as the day darkened and the fallen lay in the thousands, the enemy fell back, some wading to their Viking ships, drifting away in the tide, only to drown. When victory was near, a band of Vikings made an assault on the king's position. An Icelandic saga tells an elaborate tale that it was the Viking Broder who beheaded Brian, and that the king's guard quickly avenged their leader. Wolf the Quarrelsome cut open Broder's belly and led him round the trunk of a tree, and so wound all his entrails out of him. Whatever the truth of that day, it was clear that Leinster and the Vikings were beaten, and the High King of Ireland, Brian Boru, was no more. So ended the Battle of Clontarf, widely hailed as Brian's great victory and sacrifice. The death of the king's heir left the dynasty to his other sons. Some record that Mael Shinel regained the title of High King, but his authority would never be so great as Brian's. Sitric, meanwhile, continued to rule in Dublin. The Norse settlements of Ireland remained centers of trade for many years to come, but their power had been increasingly curtailed and harnessed by the Irish. The subjugation of the Viking invaders and their descendants was not Brian's achievement alone, but that of many generations of Irish kings and warriors who refused to yield. The stories of rising conquerors are undeniably compelling, and I think that's why I find Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus so fun. You're thrown into the grim, dark future of the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy, and it's your task to conquer the battlefields using tactical, fast-paced gameplay in the palm of your hand. You build your army collecting and leading over 60 legendary Warhammer 40,000 champions from 15 playable factions. I also love how engaged and passionate the player base is. Over 3.5 million people have joined the Tacticus battles, and you can join that player base anytime from anywhere in fast-paced PvE campaigns, tightly competitive PvP battles, and collaborative boss fights under your guild banner.